watching the behaviour of the Chinese state throughout the Antarctic and throughout the Australian claim, I would be very worried if I was an Arctic stakeholder.
We will measure our success not only by the battles we win, but also by the wars we end.
Right now, all eyes are on Washington. But who's actually watching Europe at the moment?
And then Daddy has to sometimes use strong language.
The IDF will continue to uphold the ceasefire agreement and will respond firmly to any violation of it.
They aim to reshape the rules of access and influence to their advantage, challenging openness, fairness, and the rule of law. That's the head of NATO's Military Council on Russia and China's new strategy in the Arctic. There is no doubt that the ice at the pole is melting and tensions there rising. Last week, a 294-metre-long container ship became the first of its size to make the voyage from China to Europe via Russia's Arctic Passage. The Istanbul Bridge made it from Ningbo to Felixstowe in just 21 days, half the time it would usually take via Suez. And where commerce leads, competition and confrontation follow. This week, Russia said it had successfully tested a nuclear-powered missile over Novaya Zemlya, the Arctic island where it used to test H-bombs. Norway's defence minister told this newspaper that Russia is stepping up its nuclear forces in the Kola Peninsula. So what do Russia and China want in the North Pole? If a container ship can make the journey, why shouldn't warships? Should NATO be worried about a Chinese fleet appearing in the North Atlantic? And is China also making a grab for Antarctica? To discuss all this, we're joined by Caroline Kennedy-Pike, Professor of War Studies at Loughborough University, and Dr Elizabeth Buchanan, a Senior Fellow at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute and a polar geopolitics expert. Welcome to Battle Lines. Could we start maybe with this ship, the Istanbul Bridge? Because, I'm aware that the Northeast Passage, the Arctic Sea Route, is meant to be on the verge of becoming a thing for at least 20 years. So I'm interested in whether either of you believes that this is as significant a moment as it's being made out. Caroline, go ahead.
So you're quite right. We've been hearing for many years now that ice melt, the melting of the Arctic, will make new routes more accessible to a variety of actors. And we're interested in this not just because of melt, and there is scientific debate about how rapidly and for how long, but we're interested really because it challenges the notion of the Arctic as belonging predominantly to the Arctic 8, including Russia, and it seems to open routes and access to oil, resources, rare earth minerals across the Arctic to a range of non-Arctic states, including China. Although we've had absolutely no indication of Chinese military manoeuvres in the region, we have seen a more permissive environment created for navigation by the Chinese, and we have long suspected the Chinese of buying up assets, whether it be in Greenland, Iceland, or indeed in the European Arctic. So this is symbolic, really, we believe, of growing Chinese assertive and the belief that the global commons idea of the Arctic should be the one taking us forward. So there are two views. One is that the Arctic predominantly belongs to the Arctic 8, and the other is that this region is a global commons in which China, India, Turkey, South Korea, Japan all have freedom of navigation and the right to exercise their commercial scientific credentials in the region. So this is not news to those studying the Arctic, but it does to me, and I've just come back from Iceland, signal certainly Chinese intent, whether in alliance with the Russians or not, to be major players at both poles. And I know Dr. Buchanan has written extensively on this, at both poles, and I think that's what is worth noting.
Elizabeth, could I ask you actually, so you are in the Pacific, more or less, big place.
Down a bit further south.
And you're actually closer to the other pole than to this pole. So I'd be very interested in your take on both poles.
Just taking a step back, but for the past kind of decade that I've been watching polar warfare or polar strategy develop, what's been really interesting is the way in which stakeholders, so experts and government and policymakers within the Arctic community, stakeholder community, have kind of kept it at arm's length, the idea of China coming into the Arctic. You know, people who were pointing this coming on the horizon were seen to be kind of anti-China or, you know, alarmist about the Arctic. And in the same way, we were talking as a sort of Arctic nerd community. We were so focused on the idea of the Arctic, quote unquote, opening up, you know, in the next 2 decades. It wasn't meant to happen this quickly. So for me, if you were to pose the question, I guess, back to me, I would be pointing out first and foremostly what has been surprising and what was surprising about Istanbul Bridge was the sheer pace. I think a little bit of whiplash there, the pace in which of 2 points. The first point is in terms of the pace of which the Russia-China relationship is clearly sort of galloping in the Arctic. I had thought that it would be much more of a partnership of convenience, and knowing the political fears on either side in that relationship, clearly that's been set aside. So that's been quite interesting for me as an expert. And also in terms of a secondary grouping of strange pace that sets kind of a foot in the Arctic has been over the last 2 weeks, actually, down sort of in Australia, we've noticed that there are quite a few Asian states that have started looking north to use the Arctic to sort of come in from behind and follow China through using this polar passageway between the Asian and European markets. So first and foremostly, we've got India has very, very clear interests in utilising and commercialising the Arctic Sea Passage, and primarily, again, we are talking about the Northeast Passage right now, of which the Northern Sea Route, which we often hear the Russians banging on about, is a part of the Northeast Passage. But what has happened in the last week has been, we've seen quite a bit of legislation put through the South Korean government, and that is all about reorientating the South Korean shipping and maritime industry to start utilising the Northern Sea Route. And I think that is huge.
Are they talking about taking the route around the north of Russia, or are we talking about around the top of Canada?
Yeah, no, this is the route we're talking about. We're talking about utilising the Northeast Passage. So when we are thinking about the routes that we can use in that basket of polar routes, you know, we've got 3 primarily. So we've got the Northeast Passage, which sort of hugs the Russian coastline, of which the Northern Sea Route is part of, but not the full extent of that. We have the infamous sort of transpolar route, which is apparently meant to sort of carve right over the top of the North Pole. And then we have, of course, the Northwest Passage, which is internal waterways for Canada, and unhappily for Trump, it is seen as international waterways. So there's a little bit of problems on the horizon there. But the news item that you are referring to with the Chinese Supermax shipping container, that utilised the Northeast Passage.
Just so listeners get a grasp of this, that seems now to be at least, well, open in summer. Those other 2 routes, are they viable as sea routes at the moment, or are they still too frozen and too dangerous?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is where we have, I guess, to get really boring and talk about commercial risk and what companies, shipping companies, insurance companies, energy companies will be looking at. And that's minimising risk and making commercial viability out of these routes. And transpolar right through the top, no one really thinks that's going to be a thing in the next decade or so. But to be fair, I didn't think we'd be sending Supermax containers through the Northeast Passage this early either, so I might stand corrected. Northwest Passage is a little bit more difficult. That has quite a lot of sort of the cruise liners and the sort of polar tourism sector, because it's so beautiful there, but it is perilous and very difficult if you'd like to send a tanker through there.
Caroline, would you be able to tell us a bit about the practicalities of this as far as we work and how it goes? Russia owns the route. I'm assuming you have to pay a fee to use it. And I'm assuming that they get a veto on who's allowed to use it. Is that more or less right? And are there logistical issues here that have to be overcome?
Russia has, under President Putin, increasingly guarded its rights on the so-called Northern Sea Route quite jealously. It's seen as a lifeblood, of course, for the Russian economy and Russian ambitions to exploit the Russian Arctic. And it is also, of course, a link to the commodity exchange with China. And I think Liz is quite right to say that we've underestimated that particular alliance, seeing it as a marriage of convenience rather than something more durable. So we immediately cross into the territorial rights that Russia sees itself as exerting historically, culturally, and geopolitically in the Arctic. And we have seen an extension of Russian military activity, as you highlighted at the beginning, in and around the Kola Peninsula, and from a UK point of view, from the Barents and across into the Euro-Atlantic. So trade is one issue, but the military security dimension of movement in the Euro-Atlantic and into the European Arctic is of a particular concern. And the UK position is one of freedom of navigation, albeit while recognising Russian rights as established under international law. The big question really is the future of the Sino-Russian alliance, the opening of that sea route, but also it seems to me the Russians are content to push in the Euro-Atlantic area, the European Arctic, whilst at the same time, to be fair to the Russians, they have abided and gone for arbitration under international law on some outstanding issues.
Could we talk a little bit about the military aspect of this and the prospect of war in the Arctic? You said you're just back from Reykjavik. I saw that Admiral Giuseppe Cavodragone, who is the chair of NATO's military committee, was there. He gave a speech saying that Russia and China together aim to, this is the quotation, aim to reshape the rules of access and influence to their advantage, challenging openness, fairness, and the rule of law. What do you think he meant by that?
Well, I heard him speak, and it was an extremely interesting and nuanced speech. But what he highlighted was the point I made earlier, that we need now to see China and Russia as acting together. And he was pointing to the way that the Russians have asserted their rights across the Barents and into the Euro-Atlantic, the threat to the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap, and the need for vigilance in terms of the protection of infrastructure. A point actually that was previously made by our Prime Minister, Starmer, who pointed also to the way in which the rules-based order in the Arctic and Antarctica is under threat from both Russia and China. So, yes, our Italian admiral was extremely charming, as you would imagine, and extremely clear where the threat to NATO lies.
One of my colleagues, James Rothwell, interviewed the Norwegian defence minister last week, and he pointed to two. There is the Greenland-UK gap and also the Bear Gap, a stretch of water between Norway and Svalbard. And he said, basically, Russia wants to control both of those. I'll give you the quotation. Putin needs to establish what's called the Bastion Defence. He needs to control the Bear Gap to make sure he can use his submarines and the Northern Fleet. He wants to deny NATO allies access to the Greenland-UK gap. What do we know about the balance of military power up there, Russian capability, how it's building, and whether or not NATO in the West has an answer to that?
I'll just jump in on Svalbard, again, recently been there. So Svalbard is of concern. It lies clearly under Norwegian sovereignty, but there has been a long-standing Russian presence on the archipelago.
This is their mining town.
Well, less so mining, I'd say far more performative in the sense of science and having a foothold in a NATO territory. And the Russians have every right under the treaty to commercially exploit and to have a community there. But of course, Svalbard, while not technically demilitarized, cannot have long-standing military assets in place. The Russians have, after the doldrums of the 1990s, when Pyramiden was shut, their community there, has been reinforcing and enhancing its claims on Svalbard. And these are a variety of scientific claims. Science is, of course, how any state becomes and remains an Arctic player. And we have seen some mischief-making on Svalbard and an increase in the Russian-Chinese presence. Now, nothing that thus far the Norwegians have not been able to contain, but there is increased military activity in the so-called Bear Gap, and that is something that the Norwegians, friends and allies, are watching carefully. So on Svalbard, I would say it is of far more concern to the Russians than Greenland. Greenland, Putin has made a series of speeches in which, to my mind, and I'd be grateful for Liz's opinion, signal to me, but then I am a Cold War creature, an acceptance of the spheres of influence, with the Americans clearly dominating on and around Greenland.
We have so much to unpack here. I don't think we've got enough time.
Go ahead, unpack
yeah,
away.
Let's go. So just generally speaking, when it comes to I think I break out in hives now when I go online and see something about an Arctic new Cold War or meltdown of cooperation in the Arctic, because it seems to be the thing at the moment. But I think if we go back through history, we know that the Soviet Union fell, but geography did not change. So the bastion strategy that you spoke about before, this sort of to a D interest for the Russian Navy to be able to access the Atlantic Ocean from its sort of Kara Sea, Barents Sea area, was never going to change. History can at least point to that fact that this has always been a militarized, to an extent, piece of real estate. Also, Caroline underscored the fact that we're dealing with, I guess, a bit of a lopsided international theatre, in that the bad guy, so the Russians and the Chinese, are on this playing field, but the Russians just so happen to have the largest legitimate sort of stake, right? So when we are talking about the Arctic New Cold War or Arctic security challenges, I think it's really important to separate out the Russian Arctic from that, because I just think the economic changes that are going on there and the way in which it is opening itself up to Asia and further east is really sort of a subset of problems within the broader Arctic political problem. Caroline was chatting about Svalbard, which she's bang on the money with. Something that has struck me in the last few months has been the uneasiness I have found in different sort of fieldwork ventures, let's just say, between the Russia-China relationship over Svalbard and, of course, the Russia-China relationship and the tension over China's Yellow River Station.
What is the Chinese Yellow River Station?
Take back the China's sort of Arctic foothold. And many people tend to focus on the date at which it became a permanent observer of the Arctic Council. But the Chinese interest in the Arctic absolutely predates that. And so let's go and have a look at its research station, Yellow River and Svalbard, and some of the activities that have been occurring there. Research scientific endeavours, and there's BRICS also. There's a new BRICS polar partnership that's kicked off there. The way in which Beijing has been operating that research station, it has quite a lot in common with the way in which we in Australia and with our US allies are mapping how China is behaving on Antarctica. So these facilities, on the can might say science and research and collaboration, but inside they've got dual use technologies and they're absolutely about intelligence collection, and they're a problem. So I do know from various interviews and some of the research I've undertaken in the last month or so, there are some sort of fractures there between the Russians and the Chinese over just exactly how they are working together or not working together in the Arctic when it comes to that European Svalbard aspect. And this is something that I think is of interest in all of the coverage that we read about the Arctic Great Game or the Arctic Cold War, whatever sexy title you want to give it. But there is actually a common interest here between Russia and the European states that have Arctic interests, and the US, or the West more broadly, whatever that means now. But there is a common interest, and that's about trying to push back against Beijing internationalizing the Arctic. And I think that's such a big thing. And I don't know, and Caroline mentioned it earlier on in this discussion, how China has sort of viewed this space as a global commons. And if you read the Chinese Arctic policy, that is all about universal access and rights to resources to utilize the region. And I'm fearful that the window for us to collaboratively work together and kind of put the brakes on Chinese encroachment into the Arctic may have closed, but if not, it's closing very quickly. And just from a sort of thousands of kilometers away position, it's really interesting to hear about the Arctic Circle and how, that forum is still running. There's some very interesting Chinese research university linkages there.
From what you're saying, sounds like Russia and China allies, but, China's declared itself a near-Arctic state, using the pretext of everybody having access to get in there.
I think that might end up being a bit of mud on Russia's face because, shoved in a corner over Western sanctions post-Ukraine, perhaps that is why the acceleration towards Chinese partnership has occurred. I know that DP World, which is a huge shipping conglomerate in UAE, Arab Emirates, has also tried to get in with Russia along the northern sea route. India has also sent various delegations to start talking about port access and opening up the north-south international corridor. So that's about linking the Indian Ocean to the Arctic Ocean through rail and sea. I do wonder about the desperation of Moscow and whether that has led to this, the pace in which the China-Russia Arctic relationship has kind of emerged. But I do see a mutual interest here in trying to limit or at least control what we can when it comes to China's long-term, and I'm not talking about 10 years, I'm talking 50, 60 years, strategy for internationalizing the Arctic as just another global commons.
Coming up, why has China stockpiled hundreds of assault rifles in Antarctica? Just a quick message from the team. If you are enjoying Battle Lines, please do leave a comment or review on whichever podcast app you're listening on, as it really helps others find the show. And if there's a topic you would like Battle Lines to cover, please write to us at battlelines@telegraph.co.uk. We're always happy to hear from listeners and what they're thinking about. Welcome back. You mentioned there, and Caroline mentioned earlier, parallels with what's happening in Antarctica, which is closer to where you are. It's kind of a different kettle of fish because Antarctica is a continent. It's not just an ocean. And I suppose I'm not sure anybody really has a proper claim to it. Could you tell us a little bit about what is going on down
You've
there?
upset all the Australians.
Oh dear, go on.
Yeah, so you've got 7 claimant states to Antarctica, and in 1959 they all came together and basically said, let's just set aside any discussion of who owns what on that continent, which holds 70% of the Earth's fresh water. So it's a huge resource boon, right? Let's just set aside the debate about who owns this continent to the side, and let's just kumbaya together during the Cold War. And it was great for a time, and it's, over 60 years now. But what has been interesting is comparing and contrasting Chinese polar strategy at both ends of the Earth, because they are seen very much as one entire theatre. They are global commons, of which China's a great polar power. This is what's on the patriotic on the poster at the moment. And they are immensely running rings around the West in terms of indigenous icebreaker capability. They're now building them on their own. We expect some point this year, although it might push into Q1 next year, the unveiling of China's first nuclear-powered icebreaker built domestically. So capability-wise, we're struggling. But if you take intentions and capability and long-term strategy for the resources in the polar regions to the side, and you look at the way in which the Chinese state, modifies its approach and its behaviour around international rules and norms, the writing's on the wall. It is not breaching the Antarctic Treaty, but at the same time, it is manipulating some of the articles. It is blocking consensus left, right and centre. Next week, or the week after actually, we will have the outcomes of one of the major Southern Ocean Antarctic related fisheries agreements annual meeting, and that will be in deadlock because we know that the Chinese and the Russian delegations will not agree to more bans on fisheries. And so that is at odds, of course, with China's, commitment to the Central Arctic Ocean fisheries ban. So at either ends of the Earth, you can see that international rule and norms that I think we, the West, or however you want to bucket us now, kind of crafted and profited off, we've kind of fallen asleep at the wheel. And China is finding loopholes, but also China is bedding down in these theatres. And I can tell you right now, as a Australia has a 42% claim to Antarctica. So as a claim to 42% of that entire continent. We don't even get along with the Americans over it, right? They don't recognize it. But I can tell you, watching the behavior of the Chinese state throughout the Antarctic and throughout the Australian claim, I would be very worried if I was an Arctic stakeholder.
Can you be a bit more specific about what they're actually doing in Antarctica? You talked about behavior that's worrying.
There's essentially there's quite a few articles that make up this Arctic Treaty, but it's essentially no militarization, no nuclear weapons testing, no deployment of military, and any research that's undertaken needs to be for the benefit of all. So you need to share your results, right? So they're the basic frameworks. But the way in which China manipulates the system, so in terms of, say, the militarization, the non-militarization basket, China still uses defense assets to move its polar expeditioners down into Antarctica. I mean, Australia does, the US does, New Zealand does as well. But it is deemed in support of science. So there are, let's say, 100 AK-47s at one or two of the Chinese research bases on Antarctica, and that is not deemed militarization per se, because that is to protect Chinese expeditioners and researchers from, yeah, right. So
rabid penguins.
Exactly right. Or angry chess players for the Russians. So that is the first bucket. The second bucket is around sharing data. So we know that there are a vast number of satellites, or ground receiving stations for satellites, that are now set up through Antarctica, which have clear intelligence and information gathering capabilities.
The Chinese,
yes.
Chinese ground stations.
Chinese ground stations. But it's quite easily just to slap the label science on those and say, well, this is for data. We're trying to understand ice flows and weather patterns. And then the West, and Australia especially, has been quite relaxed in calling into question Beijing and saying, well, where's the data? Why aren't you sharing the data? And they don't.
What do you think it is they want? What's the end goal for them here? Do you think they want a chunk of Antarctica for themselves?
In Antarctica or in the Arctic?
Well, in both, I suppose.
I would say that it's a dual kind of global prestige. So the ability to show that this is a global China that is at both ends of the earth, that is a legitimized global leader, a great power. So there's that kind of aspect. And that was the whole undercurrent of Antarctic exploration and Arctic exploration as well, right? It's the human endeavor to reach places that no one else could, and to be on the precipice of new findings and to understand climate change. So there's that. And then there's also just the sheer basic pragmatic realist resource interest. So it's not only fresh water, it's critical minerals, it is offshore, so seabed oil and gas. But the key one that we don't really talk about in the Arctic so much, because the krill fisheries are much more southern located, but it is krill fisheries. So this is a teeny tiny crustacean that is basically the bedrock. It's patient zero of the global food chain. So this is a resource war that is well underway already, and shipping and controlling global commerce and future shipping routes, which the Arctic is giving China an opportunity to get a foot in the door, is just the next kind of batch of resources that China is looking to really to get a hold of. South China Sea could break out tomorrow, and China arguably could have diversified its reliance on its shipping to go north through the Northern Sea route to Europe and not have to worry about contest in South China Sea or congestion in the Malacca Strait. So they are playing the long game, and I just do not think that Western policymakers, political thinkers or academics, we have the ability, or we haven't had the ability for some time now, to think in that kind of decadal resource strategic framework.
Caroline, coming back to you, I was wondering if we could focus on the guns and the tanks and the submarines. We just saw an admiral speaking in Reykjavik. I want to get into what we know about, or as far as you can talk about it, the state of the Russian military in the Arctic. We hear these reports about them expanding on the Kola Peninsula. They just tested a nuclear-powered experimental missile over Novaya Zemlya last week, apparently, as well. What do we know about the state of the Russian military in the Arctic? How capable is it, and how much should it be feared?
So there's absolutely no doubt that after the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, that conventional forces were moved from the Russian Arctic down to fight the war in Ukraine. So we saw a depletion of those conventional forces. And one issue, of course, we haven't yet mentioned that the Arctic, of course, does have indigenous people in the way that Antarctica does not. And we saw the conscription of some of the indigenous Russian people into the war in Ukraine, which has provided a lot of material for controversy. So there was a depletion of conventional forces, and this had followed a period in which we had speculated about remilitarization in the Russian Arctic, and we had seen a pattern, we believed, of reinforcement of Russian forces across the islands of the Russian Arctic. We also concentrated considerable attention on the creation of a Russian drone fleet, both underwater but also aerial UAVs, in order to survey the Northern Sea route and over long distances have access to parts of the Arctic. So remilitarization interrupted, we think, by the demands of the war in Ukraine. And it's still a picture. We believe that President Putin will have another call-up and will make another final push in Ukraine. And that means that conventional forces and some of the brigades will remain committed in Ukraine. But we put that against what we see as rebuilding in terms of shipbuilding programs, the drone program that I've mentioned, and an awareness that as the ice melts, Russian submarines may need a variety of assets to move with them. Also, of course, we're very aware of the nuclear assets on the Kola Peninsula. Arctic has always been an arena for the testing of Russian missiles. So that nuclear build-up, along with President Putin's rhetorical calls for the use of nuclear weapons, paints a picture that we're keenly aware threatens NATO and Western assets in the Arctic. So remilitarization, rather stuttered by the demands of the ongoing war in Ukraine, but still on that Kola Peninsula, a build-up. But we also see, of course, the war in Ukraine with Zelensky's audacious attacks on assets in and around Murmansk. We always used to say that the Arctic was a place apart, but now we say what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay there and vice versa from Ukraine. So a military build-up.
The Kola Peninsula, everyone talks about these nuclear assets. What exactly are we talking about? Are we just talking about the missiles that are carried on their submarines, or is there other stuff there?
So this is home to Russia's SSN, so nuclear-powered submarines, nuclear-armed powered submarines. As much as it is obviously cool and sexy to talk about all the bang-bang firing and stuff that's going on, and yes, absolutely agree, there's been somewhat of a dent in Russia's military capabilities based on just having to reorientate forces and funding elsewhere. I don't think anyone is seriously thinking that we're going to see a firing war or shots fired over the Arctic, quite simply because there's this famous saying, which is, if someone's going to invade through the Arctic, the first thing you'd have to do from the Canadian or the US point of view would be send help to rescue them. So it's that much of a difficult arena, right, to actually fight in. But I think a lot of the strategic interest, and I understand that this discussion is obviously Eurocentric, but I can't help but feel there's been such a silo of the European Arctic from the Asian Arctic. I know that most people don't like to say the Asian Arctic.
What is the Asian Arctic? Do you mean the Russian part of it, basically?
Right, normalizing the Chinese interest. But the Bering Strait and the Bering Sea, for me, as a security analyst, is looking to look like if there's going to be any sort of flashpoint in the Arctic arena per se, it would be in that area there.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, if not between the Russians and the Americans having sort of tit-for-tat issues over the new seabed mineral claims that the US has unilaterally put in a couple of Christmases ago. So the US isn't signatory to the UN Convention on Law of the Sea, so it cannot actually make a submission to the UN body. So the Commission on the Continental Shelf limits the continental shelf. When you read about the idea that it's a treasure trove of resources in the Arctic and it's, a great game over who can own what, most of those resources, oil and gas primarily I'm talking about, are well within delineated Arctic claim zones or territorial zones, even in the offshore. But it's that extended offshore area that kind of, if you're looking down at a globe, that reaches up into the North Pole. That's the contest. And as Caroline pointed out, Russia has utilised the Commission over the last decade or so, has submitted claims and science and is working behind the scenes between Denmark, Canada and Russia over the overlapping claims to the North Pole. The issue between the seabed minerals ownership is something that could come up between the US and Russia, I think. But also about a month ago, I'm not sure if you were following, but about a month ago, you had 3 different Chinese naval vessels loitering off the coast of Alaska in the Arctic zone there. So there's plenty of pressure points in the Arctic, and I just think a lot more of it is actually happening over on the Asian side.
But if I could also add to what Liz was saying, it's interesting that since Sweden and Finland joined the NATO alliance, of course, the Baltic has become what I call part of the wider north as opposed to the high north.
So almost like the Arctic has become, we had Arctic creep, right, throughout Europe. So the idea
we're all getting more Arctic.
Yeah, everyone gets a bit more Arctic. But the idea that the Arctic Circle used to contain these kind of geopolitical tensions, it's just no more. And I'll go back to what I said at the start of this discussion, which is I'm just completely floored by the pace at which that has changed over the past 3-4 years.
And I think if we're likely to see, and of course states in the modern age never declare war, but if we see something sub-threshold, the Baltic is of course a key arena. And if you look, for example, North Pole down through Svalbard and to Norway itself, then the cutting of cables, we've seen this before, there are 2 cables running down. It is perfectly possible to do a great deal of damage in the Arctic through interference with undersea cables and undersea assets, and that's one of the reasons why we worry about a flashpoint like Svalbard.
And that's a great point, because has hybrid war in the Arctic already not just kicked off? And I had the same kind of issues when I was researching for my book on Greenland recently. And what was fascinating to me was the fact that, and this is sort of building off the point you've made, Caroline, about all of the Arctic Circle countries bar Russia are now part of NATO as well, which is something we never had to deal with before. But we had US Trumponian threats to take Greenland and wasn't going to rule out whether he'd do it by force or not. But we still didn't see Denmark, a NATO member, trigger any of the Washington Treaty for discussions, right? So it's not just, I think, NATO potentially tested via the Arctic from Russia or China. You've got to deal with the fact that a NATO member, the US, an Arctic stakeholder, is also testing NATO in the Arctic.
I think that's a fascinating point. I wanted to finish maybe. Caroline, you said you were recently in Svalbard. I'm not sure, well, Elizabeth, maybe you've got something to say on this as well, but I was wondering if you could just give us a sense of what it's like up there. What is it we're looking at? What does it smell like? What does it feel like? Tell us about this place we're talking about, because so few people get to that part of the world.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because I've been going for a few years now, and it's becoming more crowded. Longyearbyen, the capital city, is growing in its internationalization, a more mixed, still predominantly Norwegian population, and there are a series of bars and restaurants and assets for tourists and locals. The key thing for Svalbard, and you're very welcome, I'm running a workshop in London on this, is because of its remoteness and because of its infrastructure. Of course, all food has to be shipped or flown in, and that makes it extremely vulnerable. One water supply, should anyone want to provoke a crisis. So it's an extremely fascinating place, not just for its flora, fauna and wildlife, but simply because it is literally where I think Russia meets Europe I'm not saying that Russia isn't part of Europe. And I think that heady brew of, as Liz pointed out, research, intelligence, and melting glaciers makes it a fascinating place, a place apart, actually.
There is actually an Australian element to Svalbard as well. But just I guess if we can close by underscoring that sort of international reach and the international element to the Arctic geopolitical problem is Svalbard, because Australia, of course, is signatory to the Svalbard Treaty, which gives Australian citizens, economic rights to exploit on Svalbard, should we please.
Yes, but you can't be born there and you can't die on Svalbard. So again, it's interesting.
Yeah, but I can set up shop.
What if you
it's
do?
very unfortunate. You'd have to be shipped out very quickly.
I feel like that's a test, Caroline.
This sounds like something, a bit of a pub quizzy thing, but sorry, can you unpack that, please, Caroline? This business of not being allowed to be born or die on Svalbard.
Same as Antarctica.
So, because the medical facilities are quite limited, those who are going to give birth go to the mainland for medical reasons to get the best possible care. And so you're born on the mainland away from Svalbard. Now, of course, babies have been born, but the hospital is very small. And so I think in terms of care, the Norwegian authorities believe that people are just much safer giving birth elsewhere.
Okay, and the same goes for people who are terminally ill.
Quite. There isn't the healthcare infrastructure, so it's very much that idea of getting the best care for citizens. And of course, the climate would be extremely difficult for those of us. Liz has put me in my place getting older. I have to say, I've never in all my time there seen a polar bear, but I've seen one in Doncaster. So, this is one of the things about Svalbard, that you have to travel outside Longyearbyen with a gun in case you are attacked by a polar bear. So it's an extremely interesting place. But it is also a place where the big cruise ships come in and tip the tourists out.
I was going to ask about that. Are you starting to see sort of the environmental degradation based on
and the Norwegians
tourists?
have just been acting on that. But a year ago, the cruise ships come in, they dominate as they do everywhere, Mediterranean, and thousands of tourists are tipped out. And of course, for many people, they want to see this part of the world before the ice melt takes, it is a fascinating place.
You've been listening to Caroline Kennedy-Pipe of Loughborough University and Elizabeth Buchanan of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute on rising tensions in the Arctic. That's all for today. We'll be back on Friday with our usual end of the week episode. Until then, that was Battle Lines. Goodbye. Battle Lines is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles and hosted by me, Roland Oliphant, and Venetia Rainey. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others to find the show. To stay on top of all our news, subscribe to The Telegraph, sign up to our Dispatches newsletter, or listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. You can also get in touch directly by emailing battlelines@telegraph.co.uk or contact us on X. You can find our handles in the show notes. The producer is Peter Shevlin, and the executive producer is Louisa Wells.